Vietnam veterans and their families are haunted by supernatural encounters that defy reality. Each is forced to confront horrors that go far beyond the battlefield, with visions, creatures and forces that seem to hold dark and dangerous secrets tied to their past. Story 1: The Mysterious House in the Woods. Jack, Bill, Tom, and Harry, all Vietnam War veterans, sat around the campfire in uneasy silence. The forest surrounding them was dense, the trees towering over their heads like watchful sentinels. The light from the fire flickered weakly, barely pushing back the oppressive darkness of the woods. The trip had been organized by their local church, a way to escape the world and clear their heads. Jack had hoped it would help him forget the restless nights and the memories of the war, but something about these woods felt wrong. "Do you see that?" Harry's voice cut through the quiet, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. Jack turned, following Harry's gaze. There, through the trees, was a faint glow, a soft, pulsing light that seemed to come from nowhere. "Is that a house?" Bill asked, squinting. It was hard to see, but the outline of a decrepit structure appeared between the trees, barely visible. The air seemed to thicken, and the forest, already too quiet, became suffocating. "That wasn't there before," Jack muttered, his heart pounding. Jack led the group cautiously into the woods, their flashlights barely piercing the thick darkness. The air had grown colder, the silence more intense. Every step felt like it echoed through the trees. The house loomed ahead, its decaying structure somehow even more imposing up close. As they neared, Jack noticed something strange. The house seemed alive. The walls creaked, as if the old would breathe along with them. "I don't like this, man," Bill muttered, his voice shaky. "We should have left it alone." "Just a quick look," Jack insisted, though his stomach churned with dread. They reached the door, half-rotten and hanging off its hinges. Jack pushed it open, and as the door creaked, the faint glow from inside flickered back to life. "What the hell?" Harry whispered. But when they stepped inside, everything changed. The house was no longer abandoned, it was furnished, pristine, as if it had never been touched by time. The air inside smelled of something old and decayed, but the house itself seemed alive. The air inside the house felt heavy, almost oppressive, as Jack and his friends stood frozen in the hallway. The pristine condition of the furniture and walls contrasted sharply with the decayed exterior they had seen outside. It was as though they had stepped back in time, back to a place that had no right to exist in the present. "What the hell is this place?" Bill whispered, his eyes darting around the room. Harry, who had been silent, pointed to a picture on the wall. The image showed a family, a mother, father, and 2 children, standing proudly in front of the same house, only it looked new and full of life. "That's impossible," Jack muttered. "This place has been abandoned for years." A soft creak echoed through the hallway, and all 4 men turned toward the source of the sound. The door at the far end of the hallway, which had been closed just moments before, was now slightly ajar. A faint light flickered from the room beyond. Without thinking, Jack moved toward the door. The others followed, though every instinct told them to turn back. But it was too late. Something was pulling them deeper into the house, something they couldn't explain. As Jack pushed the door open, the air inside the room turned icy cold. And there, in the center of the room, stood a figure. The figure in the center of the room stood unnaturally still, its back turned to Jack and his friends. A heavy silence fell over the room, and the air seemed to freeze. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step closer, his flashlight shaking in his hand. Who are you?" he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible in the cold, stale air. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it moved, but not like a person. Its body jerked unnaturally, its movement stiff, as though its limbs were disconnected. Slowly, it began to turn. "Jack, don't," Harry warned, his voice trembling with fear. But it was too late. The figure completed its turn, revealing a face that wasn't human. Its skin was stretched tight, its eyes sunken and hollow. The worst part? Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque, unnatural smile. The door behind them slammed shut, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Jack stepped back, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the figure began to move toward them, slow but deliberate. "We need to get out of here," Bill shouted, his voice filled with panic. Jack grabbed the door handle and yanked, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. Jack's hand slipped off the doorknob as the temperature in the room continued to drop. His breath fogged the air in front of him, and the figure that had been approaching them now stood directly in the center of the room, its grotesque smile widening unnaturally. "We're trapped," Bill whispered, his voice trembling with fear. The lights in the house flickered, and with each flicker, the figure seemed to shift closer, its movements unnerving, almost as if it were being pulled by invisible strings. Jack backed away until his back hit the wall. "Look for another way out," he shouted, panic rising in his chest. Harry rushed to a nearby window, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The house seemed to be alive, sealing them inside with the monstrous figure. It took another step toward them, its eyes gleaming with a sick, unnatural hunger. Suddenly, the walls of the house groaned, and the floor beneath them began to tremble. Jack's heart raced as he realized the truth: this house was feeding off their fear. "We have to stop it," Jack muttered. "We have to stop being afraid." But how could they, when the thing before them was so clearly not of this world? The walls of the house groaned as if the entire structure was alive, feeding off the fear of Jack and his friends. The grotesque figure continued to move toward them, its smile impossibly wide, its hollow eyes locked onto Jack. "We have to stop being afraid," Jack repeated, trying to calm his racing heart. But it was impossible. How could they not be afraid of something so unnatural? The floorboards beneath them creaked and shifted, and Jack's feet suddenly felt like they were sinking. He looked down in horror as the wood warped beneath him, the floor almost swallowing his boots. The house was consuming them. "Stay calm," Jack shouted, trying to pull his feet free. But the more he struggled, the deeper he sank into the floor. Suddenly, Harry screamed, and Jack turned just in time to see the figure reach him. The thing's long, bony fingers wrapped around Harry's arm, pulling him toward the shadows. "No!" Jack lunged forward, grabbing Harry by the shoulders and yanking him back. But the creature was too strong, and Jack could feel Harry slipping from his grip. The house wasn't just feeding on their fear, it was devouring them, one by one. The walls of the house groaned louder, the floor beneath Jack's feet continuing a slow descent as the creature dragged Harry into the shadows. Jack could hear his friend's desperate cries for help, but the darkness had swallowed him whole. "We need to get out of here," Bill screamed, his face pale with terror. Jack knew he was right, but the house was alive, feeding on their fear, twisting their reality. With one final push, Jack wrenched his feet free from the floor and rushed toward the door. His hands trembled as he yanked the handle. It opened this time, and Jack felt the cold air of the night hit his face. "Come on," he shouted, pulling Bill with him. As they stumbled out into the woods, the house behind them groaned, its decayed exterior crumbling as if it could no longer hold itself together. Jack looked back one last time, seeing the figure standing in the doorway, watching them with that terrible smile. And then the house collapsed into nothingness, disappearing as though it had never existed. Perfito. Voenteo dividir o espacio de cada uma das 7 partes entre as 9 historias distintas, garantindo que todas se desenvolvam ao longo do tempo, mantendo suspense e misterio. Cada parte vai cobrir o primeiro segmento de cada história, introduzindo os personagens e o conflito inicial, e nas próximas partes, continuamos com o desenrolar de cada trama. Aqui está part 1, onde vou introduzir o comico de cada uma das 9 histórias, com riqueza de detalhes, para estabelecer o tom de cada uma. Part 1, Beginnings of Horror. Story 1: The Mysterious House in the Woods. Jack, Bill, Tom, and Harry, all Vietnam War veterans, sat around the campfire in uneasy silence. The forest surrounding them was dense, the trees towering over their heads like watchful sentinels. The light from the fire flickered weakly, barely pushing back the oppressive darkness of the woods. The trip had been organized by their local church, a way to escape the world and clear their heads. Jack had hoped it would help him forget the restless nights and the memories of the war, but something about these woods felt wrong. "Do you see that?" Harry's voice cut through the quiet, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. Jack turned, following Harry's gaze. There, through the trees, was a faint glow, a soft, pulsing light that seemed to come from nowhere. "Is that a house?" Bill asked, squinting. It was hard to see, but the outline of a decrepit structure appeared between the trees, barely visible. The air seemed to thicken, and the forest, already too quiet, became suffocating. "That wasn't there before," Jack muttered, his heart pounding. Story 2: The Worst Birthday of My Life. David was exhausted by the time his shift at the grocery store ended. He walked through the parking lot, his backpack slung over one shoulder, thinking about how much he hated working late. It was his birthday, his 23rd, and instead of celebrating with friends, he was heading home alone. The streets were nearly empty as he made his way through his quiet suburban neighborhood. The dim streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the cool night air sent a chill down his spine. He quickened his pace. Just as he turned the corner, he felt it, a presence. A glance over his shoulder revealed a man, large and menacing, walking several paces behind him. David's heart raced. The man's eyes locked onto David, and something in his gaze screamed danger. David quickened his pace, his heart thumping in his chest as the man behind him grew closer. He could hear the heavy footsteps, the slow, deliberate sound that signaled danger. David's mind raced. Should he run? Turn around and confront him? The man's shadow loomed larger, closing the distance. There was something predatory in the way he moved, like he was stalking David. Just as David reached his house, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Startled, he fumbled to pull it out, but when he glanced down at the screen, his heart skipped a beat. It was a message from his dad: "Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone. Be careful tonight." The man was getting closer. Without thinking, David ran up the steps to his house, slamming the door behind him. But when he looked through the peephole, the man was gone. A sudden knock echoed through the hallway. David's heart raced as the knocking grew louder, more insistent. He backed away from the door, his father's message replaying in his mind: "Don't open the door for anyone." His phone buzzed again, and he glanced at the screen. Another message from his dad: "I'm coming home. Don't answer the door unless it's me." David's stomach churned with fear. The knocking stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Slowly, he moved to the window and peeked through the curtains. The street outside was empty, no sign of the man who had been following him. But something felt wrong. A faint scratching sound came from the back door. David's pulse quickened. He tiptoed through the house, toward the kitchen, his breath shallow. As he reached the back door, his phone buzzed again. "I'm almost there. Stay inside." He glanced at the door and froze. The doorknob was slowly turning. The doorknob turned slowly, the metal creaking as it twisted. David's heart pounded in his ears as he watched, frozen in fear. His phone buzzed again, another message from his dad: "I'm here. Don't open the door unless you see me." But David didn't hear his father's car pull up. The only sound was the quiet clicking of the doorknob, now turning faster, more frantically. Suddenly, the door burst open, slamming against the wall with a loud bang. David stumbled backward, his phone slipping from his hand as a man stepped into the house. His face was obscured by the shadows, but David recognized the broad shoulders, the heavy boots. It was the man who had been following him, "I just want to talk," the man said, his voice low and menacing as he stepped into the hallway. David scrambled back, his mind racing. Where was his father? Why hadn't he arrived yet? "Stay away from me," David shouted, grabbing the nearest object he could find, a lamp, and raising it defensively. The man's lips curled into a twisted smile as he took another step forward. "You can't run from this." David backed into the living room, clutching the lamp in his shaking hands. The man who had followed him was now inside his house, his predatory gaze locked onto David, his twisted smile growing wider. "You can't run, David," the man said, stepping closer, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "It's already too late." David's mind raced. He needed to get out, but the man was blocking his only escape route. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. He glanced down, another message from his dad. "I'm right outside. Don't let him touch you." David's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't let the man get any closer. Without warning, David swung the lamp, aiming for the man's head. But the man moved with unnatural speed, catching the lamp in mid-swing and hurling it aside like it was nothing. "You can't fight this," the man said, his voice low and threatening. Desperate, David turned and ran toward the back door, praying his father would arrive before it was too late. David sprinted down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached the back door, fumbling with the lock as the man behind him laughed, a deep, chilling sound that echoed through the house. "You can't escape me, David," the man called out, his voice dripping with menace. David finally managed to unlock the door and burst outside, the cold night air hitting his face like a slap. He stumbled down the steps, his mind racing. Where was his father? Why hadn't he arrived yet? The man followed him out, moving with an eerie calmness, like he had all the time in the world. David looked around frantically, his eyes darting to the driveway. His father's truck wasn't there. A loud bang echoed from behind him, and David turned just in time to see the man raise his hand, something metallic gleaming in the moonlight. David's heart skipped a beat as he realized the man was holding a gun. David froze, his body trembling. The man smiled, taking a step forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. Suddenly, headlights illuminated the driveway, and a car screeched to a halt. David's father leaped out of the truck, his own gun drawn. "Get away from him," his father shouted. David's father stepped between him and the man with the gun, his own weapon aimed squarely at the intruder. "Get away from my son," he growled. The man's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "You don't understand. This is bigger than both of you." Before David could react, his father fired. The sound echoed through the yard as the man staggered backward, clutching his chest. Blood poured from the wound, but something was wrong. He didn't fall. Instead, he stood up straight, his body jerking unnaturally. "You can't kill me," the man whispered, his voice hollow and lifeless. David's father fired again, but the bullets had no effect. The man stepped forward, his movements more erratic, his eyes darker. David screamed as his father shoved him toward the truck. "Get in!" David didn't need to be told twice. As they sped away, the figure disappeared into the night, leaving only a chilling silence behind. Story 3: Tales of Three Friends. Paul, Greg, and Lucas sat at the bar, nursing their drinks in silence. The usual chatter of the bar seemed distant tonight as they each wrestled with the weight of the past. They had met during their service in Vietnam, and though they had left the war behind, the war had never really left them. Lucas took a deep breath and broke the silence. "You ever have that feeling like you're still out there? Like it's not over?" Paul nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "Yeah. Some things just stick with you. I still see them sometimes." Greg, who rarely talked about the war, finally spoke. "Remember that night at the outpost? The one we don't talk about?" His voice dropped to a whisper. I've been seeing him again. Paul's face paled. He knew exactly what Greg was talking about. Paul, Greg, and Lucas sat in tense silence. The mention of that night, the night at the outpost, hung between them like a curse. None of them liked to talk about it, but they all remembered the same thing: the man who wasn't supposed to be there. We never saw his face, Greg said, his voice low. But I still hear him. I still hear him walking outside my window at night. Paul shifted uncomfortably, the memories clawing at his mind. It's just trauma. Stuff from the war. It messes with your head. But Lucas wasn't so sure. No, he said quietly. It was real. He wasn't one of ours. And I don't think he was from this world. The others didn't respond, but they didn't argue either. Because deep down, they all knew the truth: the man from that night was still out there. Greg stared into his drink, his face pale. The memories of that night were flooding back now, clearer than they had been in years. He wasn't supposed to be there, Greg repeated, his voice barely a whisper. But he was. I don't know how, but he was. Paul clenched his jaw, unwilling to let the past get to him, but deep down, the fear was gnawing at him too. We buried him, Greg. We buried him with our own hands. Lucas, who had been silent, finally spoke. Then why is he still walking around my house? The words hung in the air like a curse. Paul's heart raced as the realization hit him. It wasn't just in their heads, something from that night had followed them back, something that refused to stay buried. A loud bang interrupted their conversation. The three men turned toward the door of the bar. The street outside was empty, but the shadows seemed deeper. Let's get out of here, Paul muttered, but it was too late. The sound of footsteps echoed outside. The footsteps outside the bar grew louder, each one deliberate, as though something was walking with purpose. Greg, Paul, and Lucas exchanged terrified glances. There was no one else outside. The bar was empty, the street beyond deserted. Paul stood up, his hand shaking as he reached for the door. It's just the wind, he said, though his voice lacked any conviction. But before he could touch the door, it flew open on its own, slamming against the wall with a deafening crash. Cold air rushed into the room, extinguishing the candles on the bar's counter. Greg stared at the empty doorway, his heart thudding in his chest. No. It's him. It's the one from that night. Lucas backed away, shaking his head. We buried him. How can he be here? The sound of footsteps echoed inside the bar now, slow and deliberate. Paul turned, and in the dim light, he saw a shadowy figure standing at the entrance, its head bent at an unnatural angle, its eyes hollow and dark. The man they had buried had returned. The shadowy figure at the door stepped inside, its head still tilted at that impossible angle, its eyes fixed on Greg. The air in the bar felt thick, like it was pressing down on all three men, making it hard to breathe. It's him, Greg whispered, backing away, his eyes wide with fear. He's back. Paul reached for the nearest chair, ready to defend himself, but he knew deep down that this thing wasn't human anymore. It was something else, something twisted by death, by whatever had happened that night in Vietnam. Lucas trembled, his eyes darting to the exits. We need to get out of here. But before they could move, the figure took another step forward, its voice echoing through the room like a distant, distorted whisper. You left me behind. Greg's knees buckled as the memories rushed back, the blood, the screams, the overwhelming guilt. They had abandoned him. And now, he had returned. The figure lunged forward, its unnatural speed catching them off guard. Paul swung the chair, but it passed right through the figure as though it were made of smoke. The figure from their past lunged at Greg, its hollow eyes glowing with a terrifying hunger. Greg screamed, backing away, but the figure was relentless. Paul and Lucas were frozen, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. This wasn't just a memory, it was a nightmare made real. He's come to take us, Greg whispered, his voice shaking. He's come for revenge. Paul's mind raced. They had buried him. They had left him behind in Vietnam, but now he was here, this twisted, vengeful spirit. The guilt they had carried for years had finally manifested into something far worse than they could have imagined. The figure lunged again, this time knocking over chairs and tables as it moved with unnatural speed. It reached out, its hands like claws, and grabbed Greg by the throat. "No!" Paul shouted, rushing forward. He grabbed a chair and swung it with all his strength. This time, the chair connected, sending the figure staggering back. "We have to finish it," Lucas said, his voice grim. "We have to stop it, or it'll never leave us alone." "But how do you stop something that's already dead?" The spirit lunged again, its ghostly form shifting and bending like smoke, wrapping its fingers around Greg's throat. Paul and Lucas moved as one, grabbing chairs and anything they could find to fight the spirit off. "He wants to finish what we started," Greg gasped, his voice strained as the entity tightened its grip. "We left him to die, and now he's come back." Lucas swung a bottle at the spirit, and this time, it connected. The spirit let out an unnatural wail, its form flickering as though it was being pulled between two worlds. "Bury it again!" Paul shouted, realizing that they had to return the spirit to rest. "We have to bury it right." Together, the three men fought their way through the spirit's relentless assault, and after what felt like an eternity, they managed to force it back, returning to the site where they had buried their comrade all those years ago. With trembling hands, they completed the ritual, and the spirit vanished into the ground. Story 4: The UFO Experience. Joe, an aging Vietnam veteran, lived alone in a small town in North Carolina. His routine was simple: wake up, feed his dog Max, and go for a morning walk before heading to the diner where he worked. He liked the peace of small-town life. That morning, however, as he walked along the quiet street, something caught his eye in the sky. A strange, glowing object hovered above the tree line, moving in a way that defied logic. It wasn't a plane, and it wasn't a helicopter. It was something else, something unnatural. Joe stopped in his tracks, staring in disbelief as the object floated closer. Max whimpered beside him, sensing something was wrong. As the object descended, Joe's heart pounded in his chest. He had seen strange things in the war, but nothing like this. Joe couldn't believe what he was seeing. The glowing object in the sky was now hovering just above the treetops, its movements smooth and deliberate, almost like it was scanning the ground below. Max, his dog, was whimpering beside him, pulling on the leash, trying to drag Joe away from the sight. But Joe couldn't move. He was frozen, his eyes locked on the strange, silent craft. Suddenly, the lights from the object shifted, focusing directly on Joe. For a moment, everything around him went completely silent. Even the wind stopped. It was as if the world itself had paused, waiting. Then, without warning, a bright beam shot down from the craft, engulfing Joe and Max in an otherworldly glow. Joe's heart raced as he felt his body grow weightless, his vision blurring. Max barked in panic, and then, nothing. The craft vanished. Joe stood alone in the dark woods, trembling. Joe sat in his kitchen, staring blankly at the cup of coffee in front of him. Max lay at his feet, still whimpering from the strange encounter in the woods. His hands shook as he replayed the events in his mind, the glowing object, the beam of light, the feeling of weightlessness. He had tried to convince himself it was all a dream, but the memory was too vivid, too real. As Joe reached for the cup, his hand froze. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw something outside the window. A light, a faint, pulsing glow, just like the one he had seen before. Max growled, his ears flat against his head. Joe stood up slowly, his heart pounding. He moved to the window and peered outside, his breath catching in his throat. The light was closer now, hovering just above the trees. It wasn't over. They had come back. Joe's heart raced as he watched the glowing object descend slowly from the sky, coming closer and closer to his small house. The pulsing light bathed the trees in an eerie glow, and Max whimpered beside him, the dog's instincts screaming for him to run. Joe backed away from the window, his mind racing. He had seen strange things during the war, things he had never talked about. But this was something else entirely. This was something otherworldly. As the light grew brighter, a deep, low hum vibrated through the air. The sound was so intense it rattled the windows, shaking the walls of the house. Joe grabbed Max's collar, pulling the dog toward the door, but before they could leave, the entire room was bathed in a blinding white light. Joe shielded his eyes, panic gripping him as the light consumed everything. The hum grew louder, more unbearable, until finally, everything went silent. Joe opened his eyes to find the light gone. The craft had vanished. But when he looked around the room, he realized something was terribly wrong. Max was gone. Joe frantically searched the house, calling for Max. His heart raced with panic, his voice growing hoarse as he shouted the dog's name. But there was no response, no bark, no sign of the dog anywhere. The pulsing light outside had vanished, but the house still buzzed with an unnatural energy. Joe could feel it in the air, in the very walls around him. Something had taken Max, something from beyond this world. Suddenly, a high-pitched whine filled the room, and Joe clutched his ears, grimacing at the pain. The sound seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere at once, disorienting him. His vision blurred, and he stumbled, collapsing against the wall. As the sound grew louder, Joe's mind raced back to the war, to the nights spent in the jungle, when strange lights would appear in the sky, and soldiers would vanish without a trace. They had always dismissed it as superstition back then. But now he wasn't so sure. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Joe blinked, his head pounding, but when he looked up, he wasn't alone. A tall, thin figure stood in the doorway, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Joe stared at the tall figure standing in his doorway, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It wasn't human, he knew that immediately. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The air around it buzzed with an otherworldly energy, sending a shiver down Joe's spine. "Where's Max?" Joe demanded, his voice trembling with fear and desperation. But the figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, watching him. The high-pitched whine returned, louder now, filling Joe's head with unbearable pressure. He clutched his ears, falling to his knees as the sound grew louder, sharper. "You took my dog!" Joe shouted, struggling to stand. But the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it were weighing him, deciding what to do next. Joe's vision blurred, the world around him distorting as the whine became unbearable. His mind flashed back to the war, to the nights in the jungle, when strange lights filled the sky and soldiers vanished into the darkness, never to return. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. Joe opened his eyes to find the figure standing directly in front of him, its hand reaching out. Joe lay on the floor, his vision blurry as the tall, glowing figure reached out to him. He could feel his mind being pulled apart, his thoughts scattered by the otherworldly presence standing before him. The figure's long fingers touched his forehead, and suddenly, memories of the war flooded back, nights when men vanished, taken by lights in the sky. "They've been here all along," Joe whispered, the realization sinking in. "You've been watching us." The figure didn't speak, but Joe felt its thoughts pressing into his mind. It was showing him something, a vast network of these creatures, observing, learning, and occasionally, taking. Max's bark broke through the fog in Joe's mind. His dog was alive, somewhere nearby. Summoning the last of his strength, Joe staggered to his feet, his mind clearing enough to find Max in a corner of the room, trembling but unharmed. The figure stepped back, as if satisfied. Without a word, it vanished into the light, leaving Joe and Max alone in the now eerily silent house. Story 5. Dark Nightmares. Emily had always been plagued by nightmares. Since childhood, a dark figure would visit her in her dreams, a shadowy presence that filled her with an unshakable dread. The figure never spoke, never moved, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. Now, as an adult, the nightmares had returned, more vivid and terrifying than ever. Every night, the same figure stood at the foot of her bed, watching her. And every night, she woke up gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. Desperate for answers, Emily reached out to her friend, Karen, whose husband had served in Vietnam. Karen had mentioned strange things happening to him after the war. Maybe Karen could help Emily understand what was happening to her. Emily sat across from Karen, sipping tea in her friend's cozy kitchen, but her mind was miles away. She had barely slept in weeks, the nightmares returning every night with increasing intensity. The figure, the dark presence, was always there, watching her, creeping closer. "I can't take it anymore," Emily whispered, her hands trembling around the teacup. "It feels real, Karen. I wake up and I feel like it's still in the room." Karen nodded sympathetically. "My husband went through something similar after Vietnam. He said there were things he couldn't explain. Things that followed him back." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Followed him?" Karen leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "Whatever haunted him out there, it's still with us." Emily tossed and turned in bed, her sleep restless and disturbed. The nightmares were worse than ever. The shadowy figure stood at the foot of her bed, its presence suffocating, pressing down on her chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, but she felt its eyes on her, watching her every breath. In the dream, the figure reached out, its hand extending impossibly long, its fingers curling toward her. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. The weight on her chest grew heavier, and she felt herself sinking deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, she awoke with a gasp, her body drenched in sweat. The room was silent, but the figure still lingered in her mind. It felt like it had followed her out of the dream, like it was still there, just beyond the edges of her vision. She needed help. Karen had mentioned something following her husband after the war. Maybe it was happening to Emily too. Emily stared at Karen, her hands trembling as she listened to her friend's words. "You think it followed your husband home from the war?" she asked, her voice shaky. Karen nodded, her face pale. "After he came back, things were never the same. He started seeing things, dark figures, shadows. At first, I thought it was PTSD, but then, it wasn't just him." Emily's heart raced as Karen continued. "I started seeing them too. At night. In our room. Watching us." Emily felt a cold chill crawl down her spine. "And now, you think it's happening to me?" Karen leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Whatever it is, it latches onto fear. The more you fear it, the closer it gets." Emily swallowed hard. She had to get control of her fear, but how? The nightmares had gotten worse. The figure in her dreams was getting closer, more tangible. Last night, she had woken up with a bruise on her arm. And she hadn't been alone in the room. Emily sat on her bed, staring at the bruise on her arm. It was deep, purple, and shaped like a handprint, though no one had touched her. Not in the waking world, at least. The nightmares had grown more intense, more real, and now the figure was no longer confined to her dreams. It was following her into the waking world. The door to her bedroom creaked open, and Emily froze. For a moment, she thought it was Karen, but then she remembered, Karen had left hours ago. Her breath caught in her throat as a shadow moved in the doorway, long and distorted, the figure taller than it had been before. It stepped into the room, its body stretching unnaturally, its face hidden in the darkness. Emily, the figure whispered, its voice soft but echoing in her mind. "I'm here." Emily scrambled backward on the bed, her heart pounding. She had to get out, had to escape this nightmare made real. But the figure was already too close, its presence overwhelming, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. Emily scrambled back on her bed, her heart racing as the shadowy figure loomed closer, its presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. The air around her grew colder, and her breath came in shallow gasps. The figure's long, spindly fingers reached out, brushing the edge of the bed. "No, no, no," Emily whispered, her body trembling. She had to get out. She had to escape. The figure's face was still obscured by darkness, but she could feel its eyes on her, cold, unblinking, and filled with something far worse than hatred. It was as if the figure had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to be completely helpless. Karen's words echoed in Emily's mind, "It feeds on your fear. The more you fear it, the closer it gets." But how could she not be afraid? This thing was real. It was right in front of her, and she couldn't wake up from this nightmare. The figure lunged forward, its fingers wrapping around her wrist. Emily screamed, thrashing in panic, but the figure held tight, its grip like ice. As she fought to free herself, the room around her seemed to shift, darkening, pulling her deeper into the nightmare. Emily's body was frozen in place, her mind spinning as the figure pulled her deeper into the nightmare. Its grip on her wrist was cold, its face still hidden in shadow. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she fought to control her fear. Karen's warning echoed in her mind, "The more you fear it, the stronger it becomes." She closed her eyes, forcing herself to calm down, to breathe. "You're not real," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. "You're just a nightmare." The figure's grip tightened, but Emily held on to her thoughts, pushing back against the fear that threatened to consume her. Slowly, the darkness began to fade. The figure's hold weakened. "You can't hurt me," Emily repeated, her confidence growing. "You're nothing." With one final effort, Emily broke free from the figure's grasp. The nightmare shattered around her, and she found herself sitting on her bed, the room bathed in soft morning light. It was over. Story 6, The Creature in the Closet. Officer Mike Donovan had been on the force for 15 years, and he'd seen some strange things in his time. But nothing prepared him for the call that came in late that night. An elderly woman had reported strange noises coming from her closet. Normally, it would have been an easy case of nothing to see here, but there was something in her voice that made him uneasy, pure terror. When Mike arrived at the woman's home, she led him to her bedroom, her hands trembling. The door to the closet was slightly ajar. "There's something in there," she whispered. Mike approached cautiously, hand on his gun, and pulled the door open. The moment the door creaked, a cold gust of air hit him, and something moved. Officer Mike Donovan stood in the old woman's bedroom, staring at the slightly open closet door. His hand rested on his gun as he listened for any movement. The woman, Mrs. Abernathy, was sitting on her bed, her eyes wide with fear. "I swear, it's in there," she whispered. Mike didn't want to admit it, but there was something deeply unsettling about the room. The air felt cold, unnaturally cold, and there was a strange smell, damp and earthy, like something rotting. He stepped forward, his flashlight aimed at the closet. The closer he got, the stronger the sense of dread became. His pulse quickened. With one swift motion, he yanked the closet door open, shining his light inside. It was empty. But then, something shifted behind him. Mike Donovan stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. Something had moved behind him, he was sure of it. Slowly, he turned, his hand gripping his flashlight tightly. The room was bathed in a dim, eerie glow, the shadows dancing on the walls. "Mrs. Abernathy," he called out, but the old woman didn't answer. The closet door was wide open now, but it was empty. Mike took a cautious step forward, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But something compelled him to stay. As he reached the center of the room, he heard it again, a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. He spun around, shining his light toward the bed. His heart raced. There, in the corner of the room, crouched a figure. It was small, gaunt, and its eyes gleamed in the darkness. Mike's flashlight flickered as he aimed it at the figure crouched in the corner. His hand instinctively went to his gun, but something deep inside him told him it wouldn't be enough. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. The figure shifted, its body contorting as it slowly rose to its feet. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, as though it was learning how to move for the first time. Mike's breath caught in his throat as the figure turned its head toward him. Its eyes were pitch black, reflecting no light, and its face, gaunt and stretched, was twisted into a grotesque smile. The corners of its mouth were pulled back unnaturally far, exposing rows of sharp, yellow teeth. Mike backed up, his pulse pounding in his ears. "What are you?" The creature took a step forward, its feet dragging on the floor. The sound of its movements was a sickening mix of wet sloshing and dry cracking. Mike stumbled back, his body frozen in terror as the thing advanced toward him, its black eyes locked onto his. Mike backed into the wall, his flashlight flickering as the creature advanced on him. Its twisted body moved in unnatural jerks, its black eyes fixed on him with a hunger that chilled him to the core. "What are you?" Mike whispered, his voice trembling. The creature's mouth opened, wider than any human mouth should, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. It let out a low, guttural growl, the sound reverberating through the room, shaking the very walls. In a desperate move, Mike pulled his gun and fired, the shot echoing through the small bedroom. But the bullet passed straight through the creature as if it were made of smoke. It let out a low, wheezing laugh, its smile growing wider. Mike's heart raced as the realization hit him, he couldn't fight this thing. It wasn't from this world. The creature lunged, its long, bony fingers stretching toward him, and Mike had no choice but to turn and run, slamming the door behind him as he bolted down the hallway. But as he ran, he could hear it following, its laughter echoing in his ears. Mike sprinted down the hallway, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Behind him, the creature's laughter echoed, a sickening, wheezing sound that sent chills down his spine. It was toying with him, playing a game that only it understood. He reached the front door, fumbling with the lock, but his hands were shaking too much to get a grip. The creature's footsteps grew louder, closer. Mike turned, his flashlight casting a weak beam down the hallway, just in time to see the creature crawling toward him on all fours, its limbs bending at impossible angles. "Get away from me!" Mike shouted, kicking the door open and stumbling outside. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but he didn't stop. He bolted down the front steps, sprinting toward his car. Behind him, the creature let out a low, guttural growl. Mike didn't look back, he couldn't. He knew if he did, the thing would be right behind him. He reached his car, fumbling with the keys, but his hands were slick with sweat. The creature's shadow loomed over him, and for a moment, he thought it was over. But then, the sound of sirens filled the air. The sirens grew louder as Mike fumbled with his keys, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The creature's twisted form was closing in, its eyes gleaming with malicious intent. Just as the creature lunged, a squad car screeched to a halt at the curb. The officers leaped out, shining their flashlights at the approaching horror. But as soon as the light hit it, the creature let out a high-pitched scream, its body convulsing violently. Mike watched in disbelief as the creature's form began to disintegrate, the light burning through it like acid. Within seconds, it was gone, leaving only a sickening stench in the air. One of the officers approached Mike, his face pale. "What the hell was that thing?" Mike shook his head, unable to speak. Whatever it had been, it was gone now. But the feeling that it could return never left him. Johnny was used to the graveyard shift as a street cleaner in New York City. The streets were usually empty, the quiet soothing in a city that never seemed to sleep. But tonight was different. There was something wrong with the air, an electricity that made the hair on his arms stand on end. As he swept near a dark alley, Johnny felt a presence. He turned his head slowly, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. There, in the shadows, something moved. It was too large to be a stray dog, and its movements were all wrong. Shambling, distorted. The thing stepped out of the shadows, and Johnny froze. Its face, if it could be called that, was twisted, gaunt, and terrifyingly familiar. Johnny stood frozen, his broom clenched tightly in his hands as the figure stepped out of the alleyway. It was tall, gaunt, and its face was wrong. The features were distorted, almost melted, and its eyes, deep, hollow pits, locked onto Johnny. "What the hell?" Johnny whispered, backing away slowly. The figure moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like its limbs weren't quite working the way they should. It shuffled closer, and with each step, Johnny's heart pounded louder in his ears. Without thinking, he turned and ran, the sound of shuffling feet echoing behind him. As he darted through the streets, Johnny risked a glance over his shoulder. The thing was still following him, relentless. Johnny's legs burned as he ran through the empty streets, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The thing that had stepped out of the shadows was still following him, its distorted body moving in jerky, unnatural motions. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, it was closer. He couldn't understand what he was seeing. Its face was twisted, the features all wrong, as though someone had taken a person and melted them into something unrecognizable. "Get away from me!" Johnny shouted, but the figure didn't stop. He turned a corner, ducking into an alleyway, his heart pounding in his ears. For a moment, he thought he had lost it, but then a soft scraping sound echoed from behind him. Johnny pressed himself against the wall, his breath catching in his throat as the figure emerged from the darkness, closer than ever. Johnny's back pressed against the cold brick wall as he struggled to control his breathing. The thing, whatever it was, stood just a few feet away, its head tilted unnaturally to the side as it stared at him with hollow, dead eyes. Its body was twisted, its limbs bent at odd angles, and the sound of its raspy breathing filled the narrow alley. Johnny had no idea how long he could stay hidden. The creature hadn't moved, but it felt like it was waiting for something, waiting for him to make a mistake. He slowly reached for his phone, praying the light wouldn't attract the thing's attention. His fingers trembled as he opened the flashlight app, but as soon as the light flickered on, the creature's head snapped toward him. Johnny's heart leapt into his throat as the thing lunged, its body jerking forward with horrifying speed. He turned and ran, his legs burning as the creature's rasping breaths grew closer behind him. Johnny ran through the dark streets, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear the creature behind him, its rasping breaths growing louder as it gained on him. He had no idea where he was going, his mind was focused solely on getting away from the thing that had crawled out of the shadows. He turned a corner, ducking into a narrow alley, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he thought he had lost it. But then, from the darkness, came the scraping sound of claws on the pavement. Johnny pressed his back against the wall, his eyes wide with terror as the creature appeared at the entrance of the alley. It moved with jerky, unnatural motions, its head twitching from side to side as it searched for him. Johnny's hand shook as he pulled out his phone. The screen flickered to life, and in the dim glow, he saw the creature's face, twisted, gaunt, and eerily familiar. It was the face of a soldier. A face Johnny recognized from an old war photo. "No," Johnny whispered, his voice trembling. "It can't be you." The creature stepped forward, its eyes locking onto Johnny. It let out a low, gurgling moan. Johnny's legs burned as he ran, the twisted creature hot on his heels. Every time he glanced back, it was closer, its distorted body moving in jerky, unnatural motions. The streetlights above flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. He turned a corner, ducking into an alleyway, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to find somewhere to hide, somewhere the creature couldn't follow. The alley was a dead end. Johnny cursed under his breath, backing up against the wall as the creature appeared at the entrance. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque, familiar smile. Johnny's breath caught in his throat as he realized he knew this face. It was the face of a soldier, twisted and contorted, but unmistakably human. It was someone he had seen before, long ago. "No, it's you," Johnny whispered, his voice trembling. "It can't be." The creature stepped closer, its smile widening. It let out a low, rasping laugh, the sound sending shivers down Johnny's spine. This thing, this monster, was someone from his past. Someone who had died. Johnny stood frozen in the alley, his heart pounding in his chest as the creature approached. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, and that twisted, familiar smile sent a wave of terror through him. The creature was someone he had known, a soldier from the past. But now, it was something else. Something monstrous. "I know you," Johnny whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "You died in the war. This isn't you." The creature paused, its head tilting slightly as if considering his words. For a moment, Johnny thought he saw a flicker of recognition in its eyes, but then the twisted smile returned. With a sudden burst of courage, Johnny grabbed the flashlight from his pocket and shone it directly into the creature's eyes. It let out a guttural scream, recoiling from the light. Johnny ran, the creature's scream echoing in his ears as it dissolved into the shadows behind him. He didn't stop running until he reached the safety of his street cleaner truck, the dawn breaking over the city. Story 8, Grandpa's War Story. Ben had heard his grandfather's stories about Vietnam countless times, but this one was different. His grandfather's voice shook as he recounted the events of that night in the jungle, when his unit stumbled upon an old temple hidden deep in the mountains. "We should have left it alone," Grandpa said, his eyes distant. "There was something wrong with that place." Ben leaned in closer, listening as his grandfather described the strange carvings on the walls, the eerie silence that had fallen over the jungle, and the figures that had appeared in the shadows, watching them. "They followed me home," his grandfather whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can still feel them. They're here." Ben sat at the kitchen table, listening to his grandfather's story with rapt attention. The old man's hands trembled as he spoke, his eyes distant, lost in the memories of that night in the jungle. "We shouldn't have gone in there," Grandpa whispered. "The temple, it wasn't meant for us." Ben leaned in closer, his heart racing as his grandfather described the strange carvings on the walls, the eerie silence that had fallen over the jungle, and the figures that had appeared, figures that didn't belong in the living world. "They followed us back to the camp," Grandpa continued, his voice trembling. "I've never seen anything like it. We all saw them, and none of us made it out the same." Ben sat in stunned silence as his grandfather recounted the final moments in the jungle. His hands trembled as he described the figures, shadowy, human-like, but not quite real, that had followed his unit back from the temple. "They never spoke," Grandpa said, his voice barely a whisper. "But they watched. Every night, we saw them, just standing there, waiting." Ben's heart pounded in his chest. What happened to them? His grandfather's eyes clouded with fear. They didn't survive the night. One by one, they disappeared. And now, I think they've come for me. Ben felt a chill run down his spine as the lights in the room flickered. Outside, the wind howled, but it wasn't just the wind. There was something else out there. Something was watching them. The lights in the room flickered again as Ben's grandfather continued his story, his voice growing weaker with each word. "They're here," he whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "They followed me home, Ben. I thought I left them in the jungle, but they've been with me all these years. Ben's hands trembled as he listened, his mind struggling to make sense of what his grandfather was saying. "Who followed you, Grandpa?" His grandfather's eyes darted to the window, his voice barely a whisper. "The ones we disturbed in the temple. They weren't meant to be seen. They weren't human." Ben felt a chill run down his spine. The room felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, as if something was moving within them. Suddenly, the window rattled violently, and a soft tapping sound echoed through the room. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward the window. There, just beyond the glass, was a face. Pale, unmoving, and watching. Ben's heart raced as the pale face outside the window stared back at him, unmoving, unblinking. The figure's features were barely discernible, its eyes dark and hollow, its mouth hanging open in a silent scream. "Grandpa," Ben whispered, stepping back from the window. His grandfather didn't move, his eyes fixed on the figure outside. "They've come for me," he said quietly, his voice trembling with fear. "They followed me all these years. I thought I could escape them, but they never left." Ben's hands trembled as he turned toward the door. "We need to get out of here." But before he could move, the window rattled violently, and the figure outside pressed its hand against the glass. A low, guttural moan echoed through the room, filling the air with a sense of overwhelming dread. "They won't stop until they have me," his grandfather whispered. "And now, they want you too." The window rattled again, and Ben's heart raced as the pale figure outside pressed its face against the glass. Its eyes were dark and hollow, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. The room felt impossibly cold, the air thick with a suffocating sense of dread. "They won't stop until they have me," Grandpa whispered, his voice trembling. "And now they want you too." Ben's mind raced. He had to get his grandfather out of there. But how could they escape something that had followed him for decades? The lights flickered again, and suddenly, the window shattered. Glass rained down on them, and the figure stepped inside, moving with slow, deliberate motions. Its body seemed to glide across the floor, its empty eyes locked on Ben. "Run," Grandpa whispered, his voice weak. But Ben couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, his body frozen in place as the figure approached. He could feel its cold breath on his skin, the overwhelming presence of something not of this world. "They're here," Grandpa muttered. "And they're never leaving." The figure moved closer, its dark, hollow eyes fixed on Ben as the shattered glass crunched under its feet. Ben's mind raced, his grandfather had warned him, but now it was too late. The spirits from the jungle had come for them both. "They're here," Grandpa whispered, his voice fading as the figure reached for him. "No!" Ben shouted, rushing forward. He grabbed his grandfather's arm, pulling him away from the advancing spirit. But as he did, the air in the room grew thick with a cold, unnatural energy. The shadows stretched, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. Ben felt the spirits closing in, their cold hands brushing against his skin. He had to act quickly. With a burst of desperation, he pulled his grandfather toward the door, forcing it open and dragging him outside. The spirits didn't follow. As soon as they were outside, the air cleared, and the oppressive presence lifted. The house stood silent behind them. "They're gone," Grandpa whispered, his voice barely audible. "But they'll never stop watching." Story 9, Terror in the Deep. Captain Mark Reynolds had been a sailor for most of his life, but nothing had prepared him for what he saw during that storm in the Pacific. The waves had been relentless, the storm thrashing their ship like a toy, but it wasn't the storm that terrified him. It was what came after. As the crew battled the waves, Mark caught sight of something in the water, something massive, moving just beneath the surface. At first, he thought it was debris, but then it moved against the current, impossibly fast. The thing, whatever it was, circled the ship, and Mark realized with a sinking feeling that they weren't alone in the storm. The storm raged on, the ship lurching violently as waves crashed against its hull. Captain Mark Reynolds gripped the railing, his eyes scanning the dark, churning sea. But it wasn't the storm that terrified him. It was the creature. Just beneath the surface, something massive moved, something that defied explanation. Mark had caught glimpses of it between the waves, a shadowy figure larger than any whale, moving against the current with unnatural speed. "Captain," one of the crew members shouted, pointing toward the water. Mark's blood ran cold as he saw it again, a long, dark shape circling the ship. "It's coming back," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. The ship groaned under the weight of the storm, but Mark's attention was fixed on the water below. The dark shape was still circling the vessel, moving with terrifying speed beneath the waves. Every time the lightning flashed, he caught a glimpse of it, a massive, shadowy creature, its body longer than the ship itself. "Captain, what is that?" one of the crew members shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. "I don't know," Mark muttered, gripping the railing. "But it's not letting us go." Suddenly, the creature slammed into the side of the ship, sending the crew sprawling across the deck. The ship lurched violently, tilting dangerously to one side. Mark scrambled to his feet, his heart racing. Whatever was in the water, it wasn't done with them yet. The ship lurched violently as the massive creature slammed into it again, the force sending Mark and the crew sprawling across the deck. The storm was still raging, but the terror of the beast in the water had eclipsed even the wildest waves. Mark scrambled to his feet, gripping the railing as he peered over the edge of the ship. The dark shape was still circling, its massive form just beneath the surface of the churning water. It moved with purpose, its speed unnatural for something of its size. Suddenly, the creature broke the surface, revealing a glimpse of its enormous body, slick, black, and covered in jagged scars. Its head rose above the water for just a moment, and Mark caught sight of its eyes, cold, dark, and intelligent. "Captain," a crew member shouted, pointing to the water. "It's coming back." Mark's heart raced as the creature dove back beneath the waves, disappearing into the depths. But he knew it wasn't gone. It was hunting them. The ship groaned as the massive creature slammed into it again, sending a violent shudder through the hull. Mark gripped the railing, his knuckles white as the storm raged around them. The waves crashed against the ship, but the real danger lurked just beneath the surface. "Captain, it's coming back," a crew member shouted, pointing to the water. Mark's heart pounded as he saw the dark shape moving under the waves, circling the ship like a predator stalking its prey. It was massive, larger than anything he had ever seen. And it was intelligent. It knew exactly what it was doing. Suddenly, the creature's head broke the surface, revealing its jagged, scarred body. Mark stared in horror as the beast's eyes locked onto him, dark, cold, and calculating. With a deafening roar, the creature lunged at the ship, its enormous body crashing against the hull. The ship lurched violently, and Mark was thrown to the deck, his vision blurring as he struggled to stay conscious. The creature wasn't just attacking them. It was trying to sink the ship. The ship lurched violently as the creature slammed into it again, the impact sending waves crashing over the deck. Mark struggled to stay on his feet, his eyes locked on the dark shape circling beneath the water. It was toying with them, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Captain," one of the crew members shouted. "It's coming back." Mark turned just in time to see the creature's massive head rise out of the water, its jagged, scarred body looming over the side of the ship. Its eyes, cold, dark, and impossibly intelligent, locked onto Mark, and he felt a wave of terror wash over him. The creature lunged, its massive jaws snapping at the ship's hull, ripping through the metal with ease. The ship groaned, tilting dangerously to one side as the creature pulled it under, dragging it toward the depths. Mark grabbed hold of the railing, his knuckles white as he fought to stay upright. But the ship was sinking, and the creature wasn't going to stop until they were all dragged down into the cold, dark abyss. The ship groaned under the weight of the storm, the water crashing over the deck as the massive creature circled below. Mark gripped the railing, his knuckles white as the ship began to tilt dangerously to one side. The crew scrambled to stay on their feet, but the beast beneath them wasn't done. Suddenly, the creature surged from the water, its massive body slamming into the side of the ship with a force that sent Mark tumbling across the deck. He struggled to his feet, just in time to see the creature's jagged teeth sink into the hull, tearing it apart. The ship was sinking. Fast. Mark grabbed a life vest and shouted for the crew to abandon ship. As the vessel began to break apart, he leaped into the freezing water, gasping as the cold shock hit him. He looked back to see the creature circling again, but this time, it wasn't attacking. It disappeared beneath the waves, leaving the sinking ship and its survivors in its wake. As Mark floated in the cold, dark water, he realized the truth: the creature had been toying with them all along. So, what did you think of the stories? Did they send a chill down your spine? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and if you're new here, make sure to subscribe for more terrifying tales. Your support really helps, and there's so much more horror coming your way. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.